This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States of America. Today, our bold leader joins us from across the North Atlantic Oceans in the beautiful city of Geneva in the southwestern region in Switzerland. She is a former executive director of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in South Africa, a committee member of the Southern African and African Securities Association. In her previous life, she was an actress for 30 years and a director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, world famous and established by President Mandela to help heal a traumatized nation with lingering pain and deep divides. Stay tuned as we discuss, explore, and uncover how her acting career helped her show up in times of corporate adversity, because the leadership show must go on. How she and a small group of Black African men and women bandied together and became unwilling activists in a conservative, large, white-dominated corporate environment in a company still struggling to come to terms with a new political order and a democratic, free South Africa. And why President Mandela called her courageous at a large televised public event. We warmly welcome a dear friend and colleague, Zeona Jacobs. Welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Zeona, it's always so wonderful to see you, my friend. Thank you for joining us from Geneva, and it's a real delight to catch up and see you again and speak to you today.
Thank you, Anne. It's lovely to be with you.
I thought, looking at your, I've known you over many years, professionally and even socially. What struck me rereading your career highlights is that you've had this remarkable blend of, starting off in cultural affairs. And of course, I know you have a love of the arts and theatre as well. We'll come back to that. But having moved through this life and world of advertising, marketing, brand positioning, corporate communications, and then you had a stint as group manager of corporate finance in this kind of tough world of finance, and then went on to head up, corporate affairs for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, Securities and Stock Exchange. So can you talk to us a little about this interesting choice of different, career pivot points, this blend of finance and corporate affairs and marketing?
So, and it's such a long story. I'm going to try and make it really short. Interesting that you picked up on it, because it was quite a short period that I did the corporate finance work. But I think my passion in life was really theatre, performing arts, and particularly drama, stage work. So I started acting as a child. My dad had a theatre in the community in which I grew up. It was right next to the station. It's quite noisy as trains went by in a small...
And what community was that? Just if you share with us.
A township in Pretoria called Eersterus. So that's where I'm from. Yes. And so I started acting when I was 6. I started acting, and I acted until I was 30, actually. It's something not many people know about me. And so if you look at my CV also, you'll see I've been chairman and a board director of a lot of the theatres in Johannesburg, particularly 3 of the theatres in Johannesburg. So art has been a big part of my life. As I got older from the arts world, you needed to make a living. So I used my theatre background and went into a career that was linked to cultural affairs, the work I did there. But it was about communications, it was about acting, it was about marketing, it was about messaging. So it was quite a good segue into that. But what got me into corporate finance is while I worked with a gentleman called Jeffrey Hedberg, who you know, and have met, I worked with him for some time in Nigeria. Yes. And in Nigeria, we were working on exiting from Nigeria for the company that we worked for. And at some point he said, I need somebody to manage this transaction. And I said, I can do it. And he said, no, you can't. And I said, yes, I can. I came back and I said, here's my plan. This is how I will work with the telecom team internally. Yeah. This is how I would work with the team in Nigeria. And this is how I will support you. And this is the role I can play. And he's like, oh, so you can do this. I said, yes, I can. I think Jeffrey appreciated at that time was also just when you've worked for a long time and you've worked, in really interesting positions in diverse industries, you really become aware of the law, you become aware of governance, you become aware of finances. And for me, it was really how I applied myself to the new situation that was the challenge, not so much the content. Because you need all of those things to be able to do a transaction. The work we did then was very collaborative also. We had external advisors, they were telecom staff, and we worked very collaboratively. And so we were able to do the work together. And that is how I moved into corporate finance. And what also got me that role was my ability to bring things together. Yeah. It's really not about the finance. It's kind of, what are we buying? Who's in that company? How do you assess the company? How do you assess the management? You assess everything. And then there was a team that dealt with the numbers per se, which I'm not particularly good at, but I understand.
To what extent has your passion for drama and acting helped you in leadership in the corporate world?
It's helped me tremendously in difficult situations. When we think about what happens to us when we are afraid, when we have to deal with a difficult situation in leadership, a situation like laying off people. When I worked at Telkom, I was working on a project where we laid off 12,000 people at the time. Very, very traumatic. So for me, that is when I masked my own fear, my own sadness, my own discomfort, is where acting would really come to the fore, where I'm really playing a role. And what is quite interesting about that is usually after such a difficult project, I would really be quite ill after that because I contained my anxiety and my fears and I hid it and I didn't deal with it. So that's kind of how it then would show up after the fact. But that's how I've used it. I've also used it when you are so tired and, corporate life is exhausting. When there's a difficult situation within the organization, is how to build the energy to go up and go forward. Because in theatre, you often don't want to be there that day, but it's your job. You can't not do it. You let the team down. How do you think yourself into the role? So when you're exhausted.
You take us through, what are those action points? What do you do?
Warming up for a production is, you do your voice warm up, you do a bit of stretching. And then there's something that I use quite a lot, which I think at the moment it's become a practice, like a yoga practice, but it's how to release stress. Yeah. And that is really, you just bend over, you really tense your body for a long time. You try and hold it, but you basically just shake. And obviously some breathing, but the shaking just releases you from where you are and gives you a new bit of energy to go forward. It's kind of a 10, 15 minute practice.
So how would you respond to the proponents of leadership that talk about authentic leadership? People like Brene Brown, who talks about the power of vulnerability. And I think a lot of people are challenged by that sometimes. On the one hand, the show must go on, but on the other hand, also being in touch with your vulnerability and being authentic. How do you balance that?
I wouldn't say what I've done was not authentic. And being vulnerable for me it's not a difficult thing for me to be. Mm-hmm. But vulnerability for me really in the workplace means honesty. Mm-hmm. It's really for me where you are saying, we have a very, very difficult task at hand. Mm-hmm. We've got to lay off 12,000 people. We have to do it with sensitivity. This is going to be a challenge. Somebody's going to have to speak to the press. And are you ready to deal with that? How are you going to deal with it? How do you prepare people? Dealing with difficult situations, using my acting is getting my energy to be able to go and do what is necessary, is not being vulnerable. And vulnerability is saying, I am struggling with this, and we are going to struggle with this, and this might be difficult for you, and bringing people in, and crying if we need to cry, because we are sad. Yeah. But it's not pretending like it's not happening. So everything, if you think about what I've just said to you, is there's knowledge of where I'm at. For me, vulnerability doesn't mean falling down in a heap.
Of course.
It means actually showing up with the emotions that are there and leading and taking people along with you.
So that's an interesting pivot into, do you have a particular life-defining moment yourself where it was a dark, difficult challenge? Could you share what that was, the setting, when, where? How did you feel at the time? Was there a moment when you had that?
I grew up in South Africa, in a very racially divided South Africa at the time. And I think one of the most difficult environments that I walked into in 1991 was working at Old Mutual in Pinelands, in New Pine. I think it was called New Pine, in Cape Town.
And just for context, Zeona, that was the year after Mandela came out of prison in February 1990, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that was 1991. I moved to Cape Town and I started a job at Old Mutual. It was really quite a challenging environment to go into for a number of reasons. At the time, I was married to a Black man. Cape Town at the time was majority people colored. So I joined Old Mutual. The majority of the people looked like me in the organization as well. The majority of the leadership was white, if not all. And then there were a sprinkling of African Black people in the organization, but a sprinkling. And it was a time, as you would know, Anne, of affirmative action. And so more and more people were coming in, but very slowly.
More people of color were coming in.
Yeah, more people of color were coming in very slowly. So for me, what was quite amazing, just as a human being, as a staff member, is that I was a first-line manager. I came in as a first-line manager in the communications department. Mm-hmm. Colored people did not understand why I had married a Black man and why I had an African surname. White people didn't welcome me in as part of that first-line management. Yeah. And Black people were like, who are you that married a Black man? What's wrong with you? What happened here? So I was just not accepted by anyone because I was just an anomaly at that time. Mm-hmm. What was interesting for me is we also had what we called in South Africa at the time, and I'm sure the US used, in the language was used there too, was the revolving door. So people come in the organization, the culture is so hostile and people leave. Yeah. So a group of us, majority were African Black young people we were in our 30s, we decided that we're going to form a support group, and we called ourselves the Affirmative Action Support Group. We then took a leadership role to, without management and without the executive, to support Black people coming into the organization, and to also conscientize the majority of the colored people around the fact that they are not moving in the organization. So we all need to join forces. There's no need to be hostile. We are all in this together. Well, that was a very, very challenging role to play. It was necessary for us, because we're coming from Johannesburg. You know, we were like quite aggressive, and we were just like, this can't be true. Not Nelson Mandela's out of jail. This country is going to change. So we need. So for me, the role we played there was a role that really challenged. No, that put me in a position where I started looking at my activist role outside of kind of the ANC or the political, the AZAPO or whatever political parties were operating at that time. But it's almost like you became an unwilling activist, as it were, in an organization. And at that time, we were so young, and we were challenging the leadership of one of the top 2 insurers in the country, who were fearful. They feared us. They thought they feared us when we were supporting the organization to stop the revolving door. They just saw us as rebellious activists.
How did you feel prior to joining this support group, this affirmative action support group? How did you feel? And can you take us through, and of course you've shared with us how management was feeling about it. How did you feel prior to getting the support group together, and after you got this reaction from management? What was your aha moment? What did you realize you needed to do, and how did you pivot out of that?
Well, it was a group of us that we knew each other either from Johannesburg, or we just knew we needed to do something. So it was a group of people who put this together.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit before the interview about intuition. For me, my intuition really is what drives me. And if it doesn't sit well with me, I need to do something about it. And given my own background and the way I was raised, we were raised in a very multicultural environment. Although we were living in our township, which was colored people, my father exposed us as children, and I was one of those early kids who went to a non-racial school. And so this level of discrimination just did not sit well with me. I was just not going to tolerate it. It wasn't even about, so while I was never a political activist, you knew what was right and what was wrong. Growing up in South Africa, and with my level of exposure, we just knew. And so the other people who were part of it also came from that sort of, we were all exposed. And we did not understand what was going on, because Cape Town had job reservation, for certain groups for much longer than the rest of the country had. For me, it was the sadness of seeing people in that revolving door and knowing that if they went somewhere else, they'll have the same experience. It is not going to change. If we don't try and change this environment and make this work, it's not going to change. But a very interesting meeting happened. 2 of us were selected to go and have a conversation with the chief operating officer of the company. I was selected, and a young man called Ipendule. I remember him so clearly. Young. He was younger than I was, confident, strong, and I remember trying to secure an interview. A meeting with the CEO, with the chief operating officer. He just wouldn't give us the meeting. It took us a long time. And when we eventually got the meeting, we were just called up and said, you've got to come up right now and meet with him.
Did you initiate?
We initiated the meeting.
Okay.
We initiated the meeting, but we could never get the appointment. And one day we were just called up. So Ipendule and I went up. Mm-hmm. And we went and we had the conversation. We had the conversation with Mr. Van die Kerk, was his name. It was quite interesting because our positioning was, we are the affirmative action support group. And we would like to support the organization in keeping staff and ensuring that integration happens in the organization. The gentleman, Mr. Van die Kerk, was so shocked at where we were coming from that he did not know how to engage with us. Because he had never, what I learned that day, is he had never sat with two young Black people and had a conversation and thought that we were coming to support him. Now, one could look at this in two ways. He doesn't need our support, or he doesn't want our support, or he doesn't think we are capable of really making a difference. And that was what I realized was that he just feared us because he didn't know us. He just feared us. And he never, ever had a meeting with us after that again. Got up and walked out. He couldn't deal with us.
And what happened with the support group? And
we continued. We continued, and the way we supported each other was, the environment was just hostile. So if you went into the restaurant canteen, generally there was no place for you to sit. So we joined each other for lunch. We created community, effectively. That's what we did. We created community. Yeah. We saw each other. We spoke to each other. We spoke to teams in the organization about the transformation agenda. Why is affirmative action necessary? What is the benefit to them? So we had our little cells basically working the organization.
Yeah, so a little activist movement going on. Yes,
and I think that for me was, throughout my career, what I realized was actually, that was the moment I realized that this is going to be, well, I now know was a lifelong fight until I left corporate life, but it was always going to be there. It wasn't a surprise in the next organization I worked for and the next organization I worked for thereafter.
So it's clear how it supported the group and created this sense of community, which is incredibly important in helping people settle into the culture. Did your group and how your group was operating change the culture at all? Did you think the organization changed in any way?
I think we created awareness. Yeah. We created a bit of a buzz and discomfort that something has got to give. Mm-hmm. I don't think in the short term or in the 3-4 years that I was there that the culture shifted significantly because the numbers were still so low. Mm-hmm. But I do believe, people that became quite senior in the organization was there at the time. And so clearly the organization shifted and moved. And then also very different laws came into play where the organization had to adhere with those employment equity laws that came into being later on, post-1994.
Post the Democratic general election.
Yeah, democratic election in South Africa. So things did change, but I wouldn't say that it changed significantly. I think for those of us, our activism and the roles we would play in other organizations became clearer for us.
If you fast forward, Zeona, take us forward in time. I mean, you've held some pretty high-powered positions, and your last corporate position as head of corporate communications for the Johannesburg Securities Exchange. What changed in that time? I mean, the country at that point had the benefit of new legislation, as you said, the Affirmative Action Act, the Black Economic Empowerment Acts, etc. So there were legislative changes. They're not quick fixes. Is there a different example you can share later in your career?
Well, this one is a little reverse, actually.
Okay.
So there was an organization I worked for that was predominantly white. And this was after 2010. And I worked in the group. And the organization was predominantly white, as I said, very male. And there were 2 senior Black people, myself and a gentleman in this organization.
Can you tell us what sector?
It was in the IT sector.
IT, okay.
And what was quite interesting in this environment was I was in particular treated very differently from anybody else. So my white counterparts were treated badly, but I was not.
Wow.
And the reason for that was my network, the people I know, what it would mean for the reputation of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being in a meeting where the CEO treated one of the senior executives so badly, and the language that was used was so unbecoming and so insulting. And I sat there and I wondered, if I were ever treated like this, what would I do? How would I respond?
How did you feel?
What I felt in that moment was, that I was so afraid that it would happen to me. I was afraid, actually. I was honestly afraid. And I didn't understand why. That was the other thing. I was confused. I was afraid and I was confused. That all of us are keeping quiet, including myself. None of us are standing up and walking out. Why is this gentleman accepting this treatment? Why am I accepting it? Why is, the group accepting it? And then I just decided on my strategy if it were to happen to me. So it's like, how do I, and then became protective of myself. And so I had my strategy worked out. The meeting ended. I went to my desk, and half an hour later, I was called into the CEO's office with the HR director. And he apologized to me that he behaved in the manner that he did, that is not his normal style. It's not his normal behavior, and that, the HR director is there and he knows that, and I should please not think ill of him. I said, thank you very much. I left the meeting and I went home, and within a month I resigned, because what I understood in that meeting, the second meeting with the CEO and the HR director, that this is what happens. I cannot change this. The moment I cannot change it. I was also afraid of myself in that situation. I was afraid that I would speak up. I would not, if it were to happen to me, there was no way that I would have accepted that behavior towards me. If it continued, I would have just walked away. If I couldn't calm the situation down, I would walk out. I was just not willing. And people could say it's cowardice on the one hand, but I think I had too much respect for myself. I also felt bad that I was one of the few that were treated differently. And I didn't want to be treated differently. I didn't want to be, the Black girl that gets the privileges, because I've always kind of been in spaces for the most of my career where I felt someone else was getting the privilege. And I didn't want that situation. I wanted parity and equity. You treat us all the same, or that's what you do. So for me, that was quite a difficult situation. And I didn't stay, I was only in this organization for 4.5 months, and I left. It was my shortest stint in any company that I've worked for.
So what do you think the leadership lesson is, and what was your aha moment in terms of the action you took and the decision you made to resign?
The leadership lesson is more a lesson of self-leadership and self, as opposed to leading others. It was about how I know I need to be regulated for me to be the best person that I can be in the workplace. And so the moment came when after the conversation in the CEO's office with the HR director, and that was what I feared, is that the HR director is protecting the CEO.
So that was the aha moment.
Aha moment, that because, you know, the bad behavior in the room with everybody present, that's one thing. But when you are called aside and he's not having this conversation with me alone, he's actually bringing somebody in to support him. And my self-regulation is, you know, that at some point, if that's meted out to you, you will do something, you will say something, you will act. I will leave, I will speak up and then leave, or I will just leave, and it will just escalate. And I could not see myself continuing in that kind of culture.
And also knowing at what point, you know, sometimes we can change and exercise leadership and help transform a culture and organization, but sometimes we have to know when it's time to leave.
You know, for me, the disappointment was it was so soon. I had been there for, you know, by the time I resigned, I was there 4 months, and I left soon thereafter.
So going back a little in time, I know in 1996 and 1997, you were part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. Can you just sketch for us, Zeona? That was such an interesting role you played. Just take us back in time. What was going on within the TRC? What was your role? What were you feeling at the time in terms of the role this commission was playing in the transformation and healing of South Africa?
What a privilege. I remember very clearly my first day at work. You know, I just had a desk with the lacquer on the desk and my sinuses just flaring up. No papers, nothing. It was just a desk. And, you know, I was setting up the communications department and being called from my office to go to the committee room where the commissioners, of which the Archbishop was chairing, were meeting, and I was sworn in. I didn't expect this formality, you know, and meeting all the commissioners, Dumisa and Zabeza. And so that was a very special moment, being sworn in, because it just made it so official. It wasn't just a normal job. You don't get sworn in, and, you know, you don't take an oath at work. So there were 3 committees, the Human Rights Violations, the Amnesty Committee, and the Reparations Committee. All of 3 were operational, but the first one that really got to work was the Human Rights Violations Committee. My role was to make the Act, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Act, accessible to people so that they can understand how they can come forward with their human rights violations that happened. Firstly, the work I did was to work with a number of people, universities in particular, to work on simplifying the Act into layman's languages, you know, in layman's language, and then secondly, to take that and translate it into the 10 other South African languages. So that was quite a task.
I can ask you just for one moment, if we can just back up for one moment, for people who are not that familiar with it, can you just perhaps give us a couple of sentences as to why this commission was set up? What was the big picture and its role in South Africa at the time? Just for people who are not...
So the commission was set up in South Africa pre our democratic election. The manner in which human rights violations were denied. The plight of the people were denied. And human rights violations in terms of whether it was torture, imprisoned without trial, you know, just being abused, even at your workplace, for farm workers, for political activists, how they were imprisoned and tortured. and a number of other violations that happened during the 1960s and pre the 1960s, was really to demonstrate, to give evidence to this, to almost, recognize that what happened to you was real, and for you to be seen, for people to be acknowledged, the pain that people are still going through because a family member disappeared. So it was to surface that and to show it to the whole country, because a large part of the country was in denial that this actually happened.
And a lot of the apartheid atrocities that were committed
did not happen.
Yeah.
And so that was the role. So that was what the Human Rights Violations Committee surfaced. The Amnesty Committee was where we looked at people who actually committed these atrocities, would come forward and speak about it. But part of what they had to do was to actually name the people who gave them the instructions for them to be able to get amnesty. It needed to be linked to a political crime, a political activity, and you needed to name the people who was giving you the instructions. And the Reparations Committee is exactly what it says. So what reparations are we going to give the people who had been subjected to human rights violations? Yeah. So that is what the TRC was all about, and it had a commission of elders, as you would call it, that worked tirelessly on this work and sat in like a hearing in different parts of the country where people would come forward and tell their stories. So my job was to work on creating an awareness and understanding of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in particular of the human rights violations, and try for the investigators to go in to the communities who would be susceptible to speaking to them. One of the biggest challenges for some of those people was they were still living under parts of the country where human rights violations still continued in 1996-97. So it was very challenging for people to come forward.
I mean, there was some incredibly heartbreaking stories. Is there a particular hearing that comes to mind that you did sit in on? And
no, I think, for me, the disappointment was, there were amazing hearings, and I mean the Craddock 4 hearings were just those were big stories in the country. They were big country stories, and when those hearings were on, they were really quite emotive, and also what it did is it allowed the pain to surface again. But I think for me, the disappointment was really, when the corporates came to the commission, because there was there was a role corporates played in this whole situation. And it was very weak what they brought forward. It really didn't honor, in my view, the spirit of reconciliation that the country was seeking to work towards. So that was disappointing for me personally.
In terms of the, are you saying they didn't really bring forth enough substantive evidence of what had been going on?
Take accountability for their role.
How far did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission go in terms of achieving its goals and objectives in the country to provide a basis for truth and reconciliation and healing?
I think for a lot of the families and those who came forward to the Human Rights Violations Committee, a lot of them are very disappointed with what the Commission achieved for them as families, because reparations were mainly in the form of, it was symbolic. There was nothing significant. And then if you didn't come forward to the Amnesty Committee, not all of those cases were investigated. So a lot of, or not a lot of people were charged. So I think for a lot of families, it didn't achieve the objective at all. It actually, it's actually still a sore point. It was a very expensive exercise. I think the expectation of what reparations would be was not well managed. In some communities, there are kind of memorial sites where people are being, where we in memory of some of the people who lost their lives. But for others, nothing happened. And financially, the country just couldn't afford it. And I know that the model has been used elsewhere. I don't think it met its original intent. I think the intent was good, the motivation was good, but it didn't meet it. And if you look at my position, for instance, money was running out. We were laid off because they just couldn't afford us as they went on with some of the amnesty work, because that committee stayed on for a little longer and the reparations stayed on for longer and the human rights violations stopped. I think the intent was good. The execution didn't necessarily meet the needs of the families who had been violated.
And if you had to summarize some of the leadership lessons from that, what do you think the leadership lessons were from the TRC?
So for me, the first one would be, when you are dealing with such deep pain, you need to be clear about how you take care of that human being in pain and what is the journey that you're going to walk with them. And money on its own doesn't help. The leadership lesson going forward is, what do we do to take care of that raw pain, and be clear about what does reparations mean. And so
define what clearly and set out clearer expectations around reparations. I must say, as a citizen, Zeona, watching some of those hearings and listening to some very powerful figures in the country, A, telling the truth, B, apologizing. I think there was a lot more exposure of some of the darkness of apartheid that we had not been privy to. And I think, as an ordinary citizen, having that exposure, that truth-telling, that revelation, for me and for many of my friends and family and colleague members, and, we spoke about it, we were shocked, we were often traumatized, but we also were appreciative of the fact that the secret, this dark veil of secrecy had been lifted.
Yeah, I think it did well in that regard. There's still some denialism, even today in the country, about that period with some people. But I do think it did lift the veil. It certainly did.
So, Zeona, obviously the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was during Nelson Mandela's presidency, and I'm sure you've had many moments. But can you take us back to a moment in time where you had a particular Mandela moment, a moment he inspired you, kind of lit a fire? Is there a particular moment you could share with us?
And I have a very interesting moment, a surprising moment I had with Nelson Mandela. It was in 1998 or 99. Thabo Mbeki had just become the president, and the South African Defence Force and the Liberation Movement's military arms were coming together to form the South African National Defence Force. And so it was an event for all the veterans.
Okay.
And I was the master of ceremonies for this event.
Okay.
I'd been asked to do this. It was a very male-orientated event, as you can imagine, full of soldiers everywhere. It was a live broadcast from the guest house, the presidential guest house in the gardens there. I had to keep this thing running on time. And Nelson Mandela better than I do, when he got into a room, everybody wanted to talk to him, and he took his time. So Thabo Mbeki was already in the room, and I was on the podium. Somebody brought him in. And of course, everybody from every single table, about 200, 300 guests, wanted to shake his hand.
Yeah. This
is a live broadcast. You've got responsibility for a nation watching SABC2, the national television station, and you've got to keep this thing going. And Nelson Mandela, the more I say, could we all take our seats, please? We're about to start. This is a live broadcast. Mr. Mandela is not hearing me. And so I had this moment and I thought, okay, who is in charge of this event? And I said, I am in charge of this event. Yeah. And I spoke to him directly. From the microphone, from the podium, I spoke with him directly and I said, Mr. President Nelson Mandela, can I please ask you to take your seat?
Yes.
And he looked up at me and he just said, yes, ma'am. He sat down. It was a wonderful moment. I was quite anxious. I was very anxious about keeping this on time. I did not want to disrespect him. I had seen this at other events before. I had never seen anybody actually just telling him from the podium to sit down. But I had to do it. And I think my lesson from him was just how respectful he was in the way he just turned to me. Because it was because I spoke with him directly. I didn't ask just people to sit down. I spoke with him directly because he was allowing this to happen. And it was a wonderful moment. And afterwards, he said to me, you are a very courageous woman to speak to me like that from the podium. I said, you are a real gentleman to sit down. Thank you so much. And it was just a beautiful moment. Yeah.
What did you learn about your own leadership, Zeona?
I think what scares me sometimes about myself in times like that, or like the other incident I spoke to you about where I know what I need to do, is it's my own truth that speaks to me, and my truth and my responsibility. And when I'm committed to do something, I need to do it well. And I can't let people down. It's a very important thing for me. For me, the lesson there about myself is that I'm willing to take the short-term pain. Like if anybody took umbrage to what I did, I would take the short-term pain for the long-term gain, So that's what I learned about myself in that instance.
Yeah, but also there was a way in which you delivered that message to Mr. Mandela.
For me, respect, if you give respect, you receive respect. And he did that. So it was the tone of voice. It was knowing. It was a bit of a charm. You use everything that you can muster to be respectful, though. And the tonality is really, really important. I think we often forget as leaders what tonality does. The tone of voice, and the words we use, either to encourage and spur people on, or to completely crush people.
Just some fun facts about you.
I think the other thing people don't know about me is that I actually went to boarding school in KwaZulu-Natal, at the time, Natal, in a place called Ikopo, which is in the hills of KwaZulu-Natal, and was educated by German nuns in a very, very, very strict convent. I'm one of 7 children, and I'm the middle child, and 5 of us went to this boarding school. And my father, who grew up in Marabastad and then was educated in Kokstad by nuns, wanted us to have an English education because I'm Afrikaans is my first language. So we went to school by train like other kids, but there was this colored school called Little Flower School in the hills of Ikopo. in this beautiful, beautiful surroundings where we didn't go anywhere. We were just at boarding school for 3 months of the year, and we came home once a quarter.
So is that where that sort of Germanic discipline has come in? You know, was that the voice that spoke to Mr. Mandela?
No, they were not gentle. That was not the Mandela voice. I think that tone of voice comes very much from my acting career, I think, and my father. My father was very charming and a real performer. You know, I don't get near my dad when it comes to performance. He was just large. And but boarding school was very strict, very, very, very strict. It was a good time because I was there 1976 and 1977.
Soweto Rights, 1976 Soweto Rights.
Correct. And then in 78, though, I came back to Pretoria because there was I could then go to a non-racial Catholic school. So my father was after English and Catholic, and those schools weren't available to us in Pretoria. So we were able to come back, and I had Irish nuns then.
So what was your favorite boarding school meal?
Okay, so we had, most days we ate sampan beans and gravy. And on a Wednesday and Sunday, we had rice and chicken. But let me tell you, even though samp was served so often, I love samp to this day.
It's interesting how these cultural foods have really taken off, and for tourists coming into the country and going to Soweto and visiting Vilakazi Street and eating samp, you know, these traditional meals. It's really become quite an appetizer. Share with us one thing that you're currently very excited about.
Oh, well, I think what I'm excited about is leaving corporate life and actually to reimagine my life. It's exciting, but it's also very challenging, and it's really testing me. You know, there are days when I just think I just need to find a job because that's what I know how to do. I know how to work in a corporate, but I'm excited about the opportunity to try and create something, and then the challenge of creating it in a country that is not my own.
You know, in talking to leaders out there, many of us are grappling with the issues of this moment in time. You know, we're at this pivotal point in world history. What are your final kind of takeaways for bold, courageous leaders who really care about exercising leadership and navigating the current complexity and challenges in the world? What final takeaways do you have for them?
You know, I think this last 2020 changed all of our lives so dramatically, as you've said. And I think that this new generation of young people's response to leadership and people who perceive themselves as leaders is very different because they believe that they lead themselves. And so the challenge for me, well, the challenge that I think leaders are going to face is how do these two ideas come together of I am a leader versus the traditional corporate leader versus the young person who leads themselves. What is that intersection going to look like? And, you know, we can see how leadership has changed over the years already. You know, the autocratic leadership style, although in some parts of the world it's been trying to come back, but I think people are resisting, you know, to kind of a more inclusive leadership style, much more aware of self, you know, giving voice to other people. I think there's going to be another shift with this new generation that are saying, I need to lead myself. And so what role do we think we play then who call ourselves leaders? I think that is the challenge for the future in terms of leadership.
Zeona, always such a pleasure, my friend. It's so wonderful just to, even though it's virtually across the waves and across the oceans and the Alps, always such a joy to speak with you. Thank you so much for sharing your amusing, compelling, insightful stories, and I look forward to us reconnecting in person soon.
Thank you, Anne. It was really lovely talking to you, and I felt like you were right next to me on the couch, so it didn't feel too bad. It was really lovely being part of this, and this is great work. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Talking to Zeona Jacobs, a former director of the Johannesburg Stock and Securities Exchange, currently based in Switzerland, helps us think about the challenges of diversity, equity, and inclusion, of transformation, and how do we adapt and transform. When we look at a system, whether it be a corporation or a country or a family, is it a broken system, or is it an illusion of a broken system? For example, when we look at our current economic models of capitalism, often characterized by the very popular board game Monopoly, which many of us played as kids, buying houses, hotels, and utilities in popular, desirable areas, many would regard that system as a biased, broken system that favors a dominant, powerful, select few. Any social system, as I said, whether it be a corporation, a country, or a family, is the way it is because those with powerful leverage want it that way. Even if you perceive the gaps, the imbalances, and future risks, trying to alert others to that will not make you popular. Don't expect to be rewarded or applauded. Those with dominant leverage want it the way it is. Understanding this leads us to very different strategies to exercise leadership and adapt and transform and change. It is pointless to try and persuade a powerful dominant few of the rightness of your cause. Instead, it is more expedient and practical to focus inwards, to build your teams and allies, to succeed within the system as the system adapts and changes. In time, it also refocuses us and our strategies and how we mobilize and support those resistant to change in how they navigate through periods of risk, of uncertainty and loss. Zeona and her DEI colleagues understood this and implemented it in a very pragmatic way. They stopped trying to persuade white executives of the need to change this very hostile environment for DEI employees. Instead, they focused inwards on supporting their DEI colleagues and allies in a way that helped them navigate this hostility, settle into the culture, and negotiate their way upwards. The system is not necessarily dysfunctional. It depends on who is enforcing the system and how we operate within the system to adapt and change. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So until next time, take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? because the world needs you to lead boldly too.